Hi, Peter.
Hello. Good evening.
Good evening.
Hi.
We had a fantastic presentation by Danny Schmid about the groove of the organization, where he actually demonstrated how you could apply one of your many models by using jazz music. I did send you a few questions, and what I can do is I will read it to the public, and I actually told them if they have any additional questions, then they could just note them, come forward and ask you. We also have a few. We have a few online guests, and they would send it, I guess, through the chat. My first question, when we were actually finishing this book, it's actually an honor for.
By the way, thank you.
Yeah.
Congratulations and thank you. Yeah.
And your parts are in original English, which was very important. We do not translate it into German because we assume that our readers will be able to read both languages. The first question that I asked you, looking at the seminal work of Schein, what would you say are the towering pieces of his legacy? And I have a few keywords concerning leadership, and especially humble leadership, concerning culture. And we had the model before. You have actually developed the beach model, which is, I would say, a Californian approach of looking at cultures and process consultation. What would you say?
Well, I think, if I can sort of bring Ed into the room here, as it were, I think that he would want to think of it as the impact of some of his work at that point in time. So I don't know that he would ever think of one, body of work as more important over the course of time than any other, but that when some of his works came out, they had an impact that we should all remember and we should all recognize. So, for instance, when process consultation came out, there was a strong wave, in Western business to create large organizations that we now think of as McKinsey or Bain or BCG, or in Europe, what is it, Capgemini. Anyway, big consulting firms that are oriented around expertise. They're not oriented around process. So when Ed's work came out, he was sort of saying, wait a second, folks, it's not just about helping organizations with facts and data and analysis. It's helping organizations learn themselves how to improve, how to learn, how to be more creative, how to be more innovative. So the focus on process was kind of a response to the wave toward expertise that, had its different sort of manifestations and things like corporate reengineering. That was something that derived of that. We can collect so much data and we can analyze that data in a way that will allow you to reorganize your business in a way that's more efficient. Well, Ed's comment there would have been, you have to learn as an organization what's going to work before you should apply somebody else's model, even if that model is the expert model. So that, and that, the idea of process consulting has been around since then. It's, it's not new. But it's no less valuable. I think if you were to think about, what if Ed was asked what was his brand, everybody likes to talk about their brand, their personal brand. Well, his was culture. When Organizational Culture and Leadership, the first edition came out in 1985, I believe.
85, yeah.
It wasn't the first culture book, but it probably was the most comprehensive at the time. It gave people a full view. And I think what was significant about that is that he had been at the Harvard School of Social Relations with a bunch of sociologists and anthropologists. So he had a deep understanding for the comprehensiveness, which with you need to try to understand organizational culture. And then in terms of things like humble inquiry and humble leadership later, I actually think that he might consider helping. And Gerhard, is helping translated in German? I think it probably is.
Helfen. Yeah, it's all translated. Yeah.
Yeah. That one I think for him was very important because it was very personal. And so philosophically, one of the things that's at the root of humble inquiry and humble leadership is that we as human beings, and I think bringing art and music into this is another way of sort of connecting us as human beings into our work. Helping was his statement of that, is that even in the most sort of anodyne professional environment, we are still all human beings with emotions and feelings and reactions that have to be taken into account. And the idea of moving from sort of transactional relationships, role-to-role relationships in work, to actually having whole person to whole person personal relationships, which is really the core of helping and humble inquiry and humble leadership. I think he would probably consider that's the point that made the most to him, that being able to kind of end his career emphasizing that, I think he would probably consider that his towering achievement. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. You started with that Schein, a very fruitful cooperation when you created your institute. I think it was in 2007, but I don't. When was it actually?
No, 2015.
And you co-authored 3 successful books, which we all edited in German. It was like a startup between father and son, and I mean, startup is actually one of the interesting topics today. How would you describe it? Because if I imagine, if you have such a world famous father and then you start a corporation, and I remember when we talked to you also with Daniel, you described in very impressive ways how this cooperation started, and also Ed pointed out. How would you describe it?
Yeah, it's a great question, and let me give you. I think the thing that really does connect it to the idea of a startup is that we were both living in California. We were doing kind of our own thing, but we would have conversations that would start to resonate around a couple things that were really bugging us. So, a startup has an idea that, and out here in Silicon Valley, we sort of joke that a good idea starts at the same time in about 3 places. But at any rate, we had an idea that motivated us. And that's what I would say connects us to the concept of a startup. But on the other hand, I sort of viewed it as finally we were getting together and back to the family business. I sort of go back to that time in the early 1980s when I was studying social anthropology at Stanford. My older sister was in a cultural anthropology PhD program at the University of California, and Ed was writing his culture book. And, as a family, that's kind of what we cared about. We talked about that stuff. So, in many respects, it wasn't two strangers coming to a startup because they shared an idea. It was, a family just sort of getting together and sort of restating what its purpose was in establishing well, we called it an institute, but really it was a partnership between, a father and a son. And I will say that, my father and I had a very close relationship. We always did. We always did stuff together. And it's not something to take for granted. Not all familiar relationships are that close, but ours was. And so, it startups are hard. This wasn't very hard. This was pretty easy for us to kind of get together and get to work. And actually, we wrote 6 books together, 2 of which published after he died. And I guess if you're not counting second editions, then I guess it's 4 books. But who's counting?
You talk about the career anchor, the remake of the career anchor, huh? I
Yeah,
guess.
this came out
Yeah,
last April. So he
yeah,
passed away in January. This came out in April. And then the second edition of Humble Leadership came
yeah.
out in August. So just about a year ago. And while we're on that, you had asked Gerhard about just sort of a little sort of snippet of things to come. I'm now in the process of uh, doing a new revision of Humble Inquiry that will come out next summer. So, because that's one that I think the other thing that Ed might say about his work, and this is interesting. I remember as a child going, I was probably about 10 or 12, going to the MIT faculty club and having lunch with my dad. And he would gesture over to Paul Samuelson, who was a very famous economist, who had written a sort of elemental textbook that most college economics classes used. And he would just sort of smile, but maybe snicker a little bit that this textbook had sold millions and millions of copies and made Paul Samuelson, I don't know, I don't think he was doing it to make money, but he made a lot of money from that textbook. Uh, for Ed, it was never that. He always said, my books are going to have a small following. They're not going to be mass adopted as these elemental textbooks, but hopefully I can reach a reasonably, large audience. And so the Humble Inquiry books have sold about 300,000 copies over 2 editions. And so I think he would like to think that that's one of his great achievements, that book has actually reached a lot of people. I think he was also very proud of how many languages his work was translated into. And I will hold up what we sometimes call show and tell. This is the Slovenian translation of Humble Leadership. And the thing that I love about this is, of course, Slovenia is about 40 times smaller than Germany. And probably about, 5 or 6 times smaller than Switzerland. But you know, it's got a very sophisticated population, and they're very well educated, and they really, appreciate books like this. And one of the things that I love about this is that in terms of a physical product, in terms of the production value and everything, it's way better than the US edition. This is just a much nicer package than the than the US edition. It's, I mean, look at that graphic. That is really creative. If you have read Humble Leadership and you look at that graphic, that's brilliant. So anyway, I think things like that, um, they're little things that are harder to measure, but I know those things made a difference to Ed. That he, it doesn't matter that Slovenia has 2.5 million people. The fact that they would bother to do a translation of his book, I think, was very meaningful to him. So
Yeah, that's true. And the Career Anchor book, actually, we are working with our publisher to get the German translation, because it's a very old edition and out of print, and I mean it's one of the brilliant books, because it's I mean the thing that impressed me most about Schein is that it was never theoretical, but it was always developed together with companies and clients, and that's
right,
actually,
right.
if
Yeah,
you look.
I mean, Gerhard, if I could just say one other word about this. Uh, One thing that happened in the very last month or two of Ed's life, and then it happened last winter as well, was that we started talking to large groups about using this as a sort of a collaborative development tool, not just as an individual. It was really designed as a something to help an individual kind of understand the arc of their career and how they make career decisions. But I always looked at it and said, well, in some of my professional experiences, we would have um, teams do things like the Myers-Briggs Index as a way of sort of understanding individuals in teams. And I don't think this would be any different. I think if you went through and did your um, did your spider web graphs and compared them, you as a team would learn a lot about how you could interact and how you need to interact. Um, so I do hope that this gets a little bit of play with groups, because it's not just an individual book. The other
Yeah,
thing I would say about this is that I think the other thing Ed would say here is that this work was based on research that's hard to replicate, because
yeah,
it took the 3+ decades of people making decisions about their careers and then reflecting back on them to generate the research that produced the 8 career anchors that this book is all about. So it's not just that, the 8 anchors, maybe it's a good way to think about it, but it's that those things are based on a longitudinal study of 40 or 50 panelists reflecting back on their careers. And that's research that takes 30 or 40 years to replicate. So
yeah.
I think he was proud of that. Yeah.
Besides publishing books, you were doing workshops and keynotes together or separately with companies or groups like Human Synergistics.
Mhm.
How exactly did you do your practical work, and how would you compare it to the books? Because one of the problems, if you write really brilliant books, is to translate it into tools or case studies that you can work on with your client systems.
Mhm.
What
Well,
was
I
it?
guess there's a couple things there. One is that I think um, I learned from my father, and maybe this is nature, maybe this is nurture, but that interacting with clients and interacting in groups came pretty naturally to him. I think the idea of being um, a listener and an inquirer um, were things that Ed learned pretty early as valuable and as a good way to enter a group. And so I guess I kind of learned that from him as well. But the other thing that I would say is that I think he was also aware, and he made me aware that you have to sort of have a little meat on the bones, as it were, that expression that you know, in a group setting or in a presentation or in a keynote, you really have to sort of bring some heft, some theoretical heft. Um, at the same time, that it's not easy to keep the attention of an audience for an hour. And it's harder now than it was 20 years ago. So one of the things that I think helped me in joining Ed and doing work together is that having grown up in Silicon Valley, where we were, you know, often talking about technology that people would have a hard time understanding without some simplification and some metaphor. Um, you know, there, you know, lots of examples of work that I did when I was at Apple that you just had to simplify for people, because if you actually explain what was going on, it's just way too complicated. Any new technology needs a simplification or people aren't going to understand it. So I think it helped me to be able to try to take some of the theory from say organizational culture and leadership textbook and refine it down into some PowerPoint slides that people might relate to. And so that ability to kind of express visually and express relatively simply, I think was always something that Ed brought to these engagements. And it was something that I found relatively easy because of my background in technology companies.
What would you say are your next steps in the US? And if we look at our cooperation, what are the next steps that we can do together besides actually translating books? But because
well, you know, so I've recently joined with a group of consultants that call themselves a Society of Process Consultants, and there's a small collective called Design Group International, and I'm going to partner with them on doing some consulting engagements. And I think the things that we're most passionate about getting into a new set of clients is the culture work, because our experience has been companies just need a vocabulary to start trying to characterize what their organizational culture is. And while I think there are lots of interesting models out there, the human synergistics model, or the competing values framework, or the, you know, the Hofstede frameworks in Europe is very powerful. I think all of those things are great, but I also think you need your own vocabulary to describe your own culture. So our culture work has been around giving people categories to start in what Clifford Geertz, sort of my the hero of cultural anthropology in my life, described as thick description. That was his term, was thick description. How can you capture as much of what you feel and hear and smell and understand about your organization before you start putting it into categories? Describe it thickly, and then you can start you know, saying, well, that means that we're an adhocracy, or that means that we have a aggressive, we have an aggressive style, or whatever those models imply about your organization. We want people to start with a framework or a wireframe for how to describe their organization before they start calling it something that some other theorist came up with, a model that some other theorist came up with. So again, the metaphors are important. There's this very interesting progression where we've gone from the iceberg to the lily pond to the beach. All of that's fine. Whatever makes sense to you, those metaphors are there for you. They're not there for us to prove anything. So that's the culture work. Then the other thing that we're really emphasizing is the focus on relationships, and specifically this idea of if you're very clear about what's a transactional relationship versus what's a personal relationship, can you make intentional decisions about what is the right relationship for this interaction, for this role to role or this person to person interaction. And that's why the relationship mapping tool that's been in a bunch of our recent books, we think is very important, and we want to get more organizations using. And again, it's not a hard and fast theory. It's a tool for allowing you to visualize something that isn't captured on the organization chart, right? We all know organizations have a formal org chart, and then they have an actual informal influence network that may actually have more to do with the effectiveness of the organization than the formal org chart design of the organization. So with relationship mapping, can you get a better sense of where the opportunities are to create, momentum versus where are the obstacles? And when you have a map of those opportunities and obstacles, does that allow you to create new initiatives or to break down log jams or to optimize in ways that just sort of just looking at the org chart or a formal organization design might not do, because we all know that so much of what happens in organizations is informal, it's personal, it's interpersonal. And so let's try to give people a way to visualize that. So those are the two things that I'm focused on doing next, in addition to the writing projects.
Thank you, Peter. I will open now up. If anybody from you wants to ask a question or make a comment, you can. Danny, you want to come here?
Can you hear me, Peter?
Yes, Danny, I can hear you.
Great, great having you. That's great. Last time we were together with your father, Ed, and all together during big Corona sessions with Ed, with Amy Edmondson, Otto Farmer, and Peter Sanger. My question is, what kind of writer was your father? He had his plans when he was sitting and writes down, or he was just an improviser. How did he cope with writing?
That's a great question, and I guess I think the focus was simplicity for him. English was his second language, and I guess when German is your first language and English is your second, that's not the hardest transition to make. It's not like Mandarin to Spanish. Right? German to English is not the hardest transition to make, but he had to make it as a 10-year-old. And I think that for him meant that he always put, as much emphasis as he could on keeping it simple. And so I think a lot of people have said over the years that reading his books, even if there was some heavy theory in there, they were never very hard reads. We had fun with something in some of our culture presentations that we did together. is I put a section from what was to me a very influential book called Historical Metaphors and Mythical Realities by a professor named Marshall Solins. And his writing, he wrote this tiny little book, but his writing was so hard to get. It just was, I mean, it was almost, almost playfully obtuse. And so we put this little section in one of our books because it talks about something very important, which is the idea of structure and practice as being two different things that you need to look at in organizational culture. But he described it in a way that was almost funny how hard it was to understand. And for Ed, I think that's where he never wanted to be. He always wanted to be, if I have come up with a few sentences that are just too layered or inverted or complicated, scratch that and go back and say this as simply as you possibly can. So I think that was the center of gravity for him, is these are can be vague concepts, but they're not necessarily hard concepts. And the way to get those across is as simply as possible, and wherever possible, what's a story that we can tell that'll make this clearer? And so clarity and simplicity were so important to him. And, I've tried to maintain that as well, though I think sometimes my writing tends to be a little bit more obtuse. So I have his voice telling me, nope, 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 make it simpler.
Thank you. And an additional question. Did he have any favorite joke on organizations? Do you remember any?
Favorite joke about organizations? Wow. That's a good one, Danny. I can't think of one offhand, but I will send you an email if I do.
Okay, please, thank you. Ed, can you hear me from here?
Peter.
Yeah, Peter, Entschuldigung. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Yeah.
I'm Konstantin, friend of Gary and Daniel, and I worked 35 years with companies, and I've specialized on dialogue profoundly, and therefore, especially the book Humble Inquiry, of course, was an eye-opener, important for me also. And there I have one question, because I see a certain possible dilemma when you live humble inquiry, which is wanting to understand, where the question is more important than the answer, and then you write a book where you have a monologue and you write, so you're not in a dialogue situations. How did Ed deal with this kind of perceived dilemma? Humble inquiry is not writing a book.
Yes, well said. In other words, we start the book sort of suggesting that telling is not that helpful often, and yet we're lecturing people on how to inquire. So we're telling. I think that's maybe at some level, that's the indulgence of the professor. Ed would always argue that his role was a dual role. He was a scholar, practitioner. And some people are primarily scholars. Some people are much more like one of his favorite colleagues going way back was a man named Dick Beckhard. And he was just a consummate practitioner. He was a very, very talented consultant. He may not have been as influential as a professor, but he was a very effective consultant. And I think that Ed would say those are different roles. And in those different roles, you sort of have to, use the tools and the privileges that each of those roles give you. And in writing a book, we're begging the indulgence of the audience to let us lecture a little bit, because at the end of the day, how you learn it is going to be up to you anyway. How it lands for you is, we're not telling you how it should land for you. That's going to be up for you to figure out. That's why we would always say in any one of these books, start wherever you want. With this book, in fact, we often said, go to the back where there's some case studies. You don't have to read our, page 1 to page 150. Read however you want. Because we're gonna try to get these points across as simply and as fairly as we can, but it's still going to be up for you to learn how you want to learn. I think the other thing that's important in that is that, and you're helping me in a way by asking that. Any one of these books that is framed around stories, and maybe even stories that are written as dialogue, at some level are more memorable, right? If you thought, well, humble inquiry, I didn't really understand what that meant, but the story of the traveler who asks for directions, I really remember that story. That one I really get. And so if we can balance that notion of sort of the professor telling the theory with some stories, again, maybe expressed in form of dialogue, that people will remember the stories and then help them learn the theory a little bit, then we're not being quite as, talking down or telling or didactic. We're trying to draw people in rather than lay it on them. So I hope that's helpful. And what's helpful to me is now as I'm rewriting the for the third edition of Humble Inquiry, there are some stories in the second edition that I kind of feel like need to be modernized a little bit. And so, but I should recognize that some of those stories really are important. And if I think people will remember them, and it'll help them remember some of the ideas in the book that I've told them, then that's important. And I need to, watch myself and not cut out too many stories because they're, Ed's old stories. Ed's okay with my modernizing things, I promise you, but he doesn't want me to sort of remove stories that are important. So thank you for that question.
Yeah, just one remark to that, because why you make aware to me now that why I asked the questions. Gary, you told me once that there are two kind of authors: the one who write the grand theory, remember, and others that are more practical with stories and so on.
Foxes.
And yes, and Ed is a bit more not on the grand theory, but on the other side. And I find, when you look today, where it might be the same in the United States, but in Switzerland, and you know a lot about it, Danny, a lot of, I'm not anymore teaching in universities and so on, because what I see is people come there to learn methods, to learn theories, because this gives them the security. They are looking for this in a very atomistic, I would say, individualistic, atomistic world. And for me, when I understood correct, you have to correct me, Gary, Ed was somebody who he he looked at the differences. He was not just with one theory there, but he really was adapted, and he did not push the theory. This is the grand theory. And I think this is one of the big contributions, if I understand correctly, of him. And this, I think this should come out also, because this would be something else than what is done by all the others. That's why I find it important.
That's actually also a very good description of the difference between the German academic world, which has a lot of people who want to create the grand theories. Like if we look at Niklas Luhmann, the grand theories, and if we look at Ed and also Chris Argyris was that way, they were really looking at specific topics in a very, very precise way.
And they were universalizing.
And telling stories. Yeah. So no, actually, this last of your remarks would be my question. I can imagine that it must be quite a burden to have this type of task, you know, of this legacy, of this seminal legacy of your father. How do you deal with that? I mean, like the question you said, can I remove this little story that was created by my father? You know, it actually illustrates a little bit the dilemma. And I have had contact to the son of Hermann Hesse, who had the task of doing the biography of his father, which was almost too much to do. You know, how do you deal with that dilemma?
Well, you know, I guess I appreciate that question, and I might rue the day that you asked that question, because honestly, I never really thought about it as a burden. I always thought about it as a privilege, because I was somebody who, sort of was becoming sort of an old man in Silicon Valley. Just part of, my story is that if you're even in your mid 40s, you're getting old out here in Silicon Valley. And I was well past my mid 40s when Ed and I started working together. So it was an incredible privilege for me to have this whole new career to go, draft behind my father, who, cast a pretty broad wake. So I had room to experiment and do my own thing. And, without sort of tooting my horn, the beach was my idea. That came out of my coastal head. But Ed, obviously we refined it together, working on it a lot, and came up with this generative metaphor that we thought was useful. But he gave me that opportunity to do that. So I think of it as more of a privilege. And he was such an open and kind father that I don't think he would ever want me to think of it as a burden. And so I will respectfully decline to use your word, Gerhard, burden, and I will just continue to use my word, privilege.
No. I also see it as a privilege, and I remember when we together with Danny, when we heard for the first time when you presented your beach model, which is actually the Californian version versus the east approach of MIT, which it was a good example of a groove, together, and that your father was actually open to accept this kind of different perspective. That's
Right.
That's the creative act of writing together and creating something. So
back to this, and to, I think, a spirit that you guys have captured, is that Ed was very much a naturalist. He was, organizations are built by organic beings. They're not machines. And so to think of organizations in using natural metaphors at some level should make more sense than having everything be a machine metaphor, because humans aren't machines, and the reason we have dysfunction in organizations is because humans aren't machines. We could easily design dysfunction out of well, I mean, we do. We've designed dysfunction out of, automobile manufacturing. You think about how fewer failures there are in a new automobile. Well, that's because we designed dysfunction out of the assembly line. But somewhere, up there, there's people deciding, to call a Chevy. This is Danny, maybe this is the answer. This is our favorite corporate joke, is when they designed a car called the Chevy Nova, which is, of course, a reference to a supernova. But in Spanish, that means doesn't go. Nova. So, right? So somewhere there was human beings who kind of who made a mistake there, and they created a and it's kind of hilarious that it happened, but it you can see how even if they had designed the manufacturing of that to be near zero defects, of course, that was when Chevy's cars had lots of defects, but you could still have humans doing dumb things in organizations. And so natural metaphors that sort of allow for error and have natural ways of correcting for them still seem to make more sense to me than machine metaphors when you're talking about organizations.
Yeah.
And I think, I learned that from Ed. I didn't come up with that on my own.
Okay. Dear Peter, thank you so much for enriching our dialogue here. Okay. And we toast to you towards California. And
yeah.
You have morning, and we are going towards the evening, and we will invite you many more times. That's what we do.
Well, yes, thank you very much, and I love these conversations, and that the German-speaking part of Europe was always very important to Ed. So I hope to continue to keep the connection. It was that's his homeland, and so I
thank you so much.
Very thankful.
Bye-bye.
Moment weg.